Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 23, episode 2. And I need to just apologise initially for a bit of a mix-up in our scheduling, which means that the episode we were going to run this week isn't quite ready. And rather than put out a half-cocked script, we thought we would bring you one from the archives this week, going all the way back to season 2. And the great little episode on Achtung Panzer. So I hope you'll enjoy that this week, and we should be back to normal scheduling for episode 3. Enjoy.
Welcome to the History Network, Season 2, Episode 5, Achtung Panzer. Achtung Panzer is one of the most important military books of the 20th century. Written by the German Heinz Guderian and published in 1937, it set out his theories on modern mechanised warfare, ideas of speed, tank requirements, use of aircraft, and supply. It is a complete manual for Hitler's then forthcoming Blitzkrieg. Guderian was born in West Prussia in 1888. Although his family did not have a military tradition, he was enrolled in cadet school to prepare him for the officer corps. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1908 into a light infantry brigade, the 10th Hanoverian Jaeger Battalion. Up until the start of the First World War, he had been attached to a telegraph unit and indeed spent much of the war with the signals, seeing very little frontline service. He became a radio specialist and later a staff officer. Guderian was proud to be a member of Germany's General Staff, the intellectual elite of the army who formulated its doctrine and drew up the plans of attack and strategy. After the war, with the reduction of the German armed forces by the Treaty of Versailles, the General Staff and tanks were both banned. To survive, the General Staff changed its name to Truppenamt, Troop Office, yet Germany was still surrounded by enemies and restricted to an army of only 100,000 men. Motor transport was seen as a solution to the problem. With a mobile reserve, men could quickly be transported to where they were needed, counter-attack, then rapidly move on. Motorised units could be far more flexible than units transported by rail. Head of the motorised transport troops was General Chischwitz. In 1922 he asked for a General Staff-trained officer to help him consider the possible application of motor transport to a combat role. Guderian was sent and came to the conclusion that a modern army would not only need infantry mounted in trucks, a fully mobilised combined force would need to be set up with artillery, engineers and tanks. Guderian had had little to do with tanks. Indeed, Germany had been very slow to introduce them during the First World War, and it wasn't until 1929 that he encountered real tanks for the first time on a trip to Sweden. He read everything he could find about tanks, usually from British sources like General J.F.C. Fuller, who had planned one of the first successful tank assaults of the First World War at Cambrai in 1918. And Captain B.H. Liddell Hart, and he also consulted the writings of an obscure French officer, Charles de Gaulle. By the end of the 1920s, Guderian was the German army's acknowledged leading tank expert. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, the military concepts of the Panzertruppen, armoured forces, had been formulated. So when Hitler started his rearmament process, the Panzer arm grew rapidly, helped to some degree by Hitler's enthusiasm for modern technology. Indeed, after seeing a demonstration of motorised troops, he is reported to have stated that they were not only exactly what he needed, but they were exactly what he was going to have. Yet although the growth of the mechanised troops were proceeding with vigour, there was still the intellectual battle of how they were to be used. General Beck, Chief of the General Staff at the time, favoured raising tank brigades for close cooperation with the infantry. At the instigation of the cavalry, other light divisions were being formed and designed for reconnaissance and screening roles. Given Germany's limited mechanized resources, Guderian believed that they should be concentrated almost exclusively into panzer divisions. He saw the light divisions as tying up tanks and other motor transport, yet not in enough concentrations to have any real offensive power. Tanks in support of unmechanized infantry was a practice of the First World War, and although successful in a limited way, had no greater operational impact. He now turned his hand to writing what would become Achtung Panzer in order to gain support and publicity for the cause of the panzer divisions. Achtung Panzer is not just a work of theoretical thinking on mechanized warfare. Over half the book is a work of history, carefully studying the development of the tank and its early tactical uses, technical development and deployment. For the time it was written, when the Nazis firmly held the reins of power and were pervading the idea that the First World War was lost by the stab in the back and the army was never beaten, Guderian is very generous with his praise of the English and French for developing the tank, and criticises Germany's lack of vision in not seeing their potential. Indeed, he even admits that the German army in 1918 was beaten, and believed Ludendorff, the German commander-in-chief, was so shocked by the massed use of the British of 400 tanks in their offensive at Amiens in August of 1918 that it persuaded him that ultimately the war was lost and he should pursue peace. From his very detailed accounts of the tank engagements of the First World War, Guderian draws the following conclusions. Tanks should be used en masse, not feeding into the battle in a piecemeal way where the momentum is very quickly lost. They should not be used on unsuitable ground, but saved for good going. The best results are when tanks are used in large numbers, with the benefit of surprise. Although elements of the British and French armies had come to this conclusion by 1918, their voices fell on deaf ears. It is to Guderian and indeed the German officer class's credit that such in-depth study of the war was so easily possible, because in Germany relevant pamphlets had been translated into German from English and French. But Guderian does not just discuss tanks, he also analyses the use of aircraft. Although initially not overly impressed with the use of air power, finding it ineffectual, as the war continued and the Allies gained air superiority, its importance grew, and by 1918 could create much disorder behind the German lines, hampering reinforcements and supplies being brought up to the front, and it also brought artillery batteries under direct attack. All of this was of material influence on the course of the ground fighting, especially when they were acting in coordination with tanks. Aircraft became an offensive weapon of the first order, distinguished by their great speed, range, and effect on the target. In the second half of the book, Guderian concentrates on post-war development of tanks and mechanized formations. He argues it is a waste of the potential of the tank to tie them to much slower infantry divisions. Tanks should be put into massed formations which could use their offensive speed in strength, capable of achieving a breakthrough and exploiting it. Yet he is not arguing that tanks operate on their own. He champions multidisciplinary mechanized formations, including both infantry and artillery. Ideally, the artillery would be self-propelled, and the infantry mounted in armoured vehicles capable of travelling off-road, keeping up with the tanks. He argues, now that technology can put the infantry in armoured escort vehicles which can move every bit as fast as the tanks, it is the tank which must determine the speed of the infantry. He goes on to say, concentration of the available armed forces will always be more effective than dispersing them, irrespective of whether we are talking about a defensive or offensive posture, a breakthrough or an envelopment, a pursuit or counter-attack. Guderian saw the breakthrough battle being difficult. In the age of the machine gun, modern rifles and accurate artillery, the advantage was with the defenders, as was shown in the First World War. He argues that to assure success it would be necessary to bring the whole of the enemy's positions under attack simultaneously. To do this, he champions the use of air power in support of the tanks and mechanised units. Success is probably attainable only when the entire defensive system can be brought under attack at more or less the same time. When the attack begins, the enemy hinterland must be subjected to vigilant aerial surveillance, so as to identify the movements of the enemy reserves and direct our combat aircraft against them. The air forces must bend their efforts to preventing or at least delaying the flow of those reserves to the location of the breakthrough. Achtung Panzer was a huge success for Guderian. It became a bestseller, and from the proceeds Guderian bought his first car. Although popular, it is difficult to assess its impact on the German military. Although the panzer forces grew rapidly in the late 1930s, by the time the outbreak of war occurred, only 6 panzer divisions existed. As predicted, the light divisions instigated by the cavalry when used in Poland performed poorly, and all 4 were eventually converted to panzer divisions. It's interesting to note that Guderian never uses the phrase blitzkrieg, lightning war, and neither was it, nor did it ever become part of the German military vocabulary. It was a term first used in Time magazine to describe the German offensive in Poland, and ever since it has conjured up images of panzer divisions charging across the countryside with the Stukas and Luftwaffe in close support. Guderian was a talented military thinker and historian. In Achtung Panzer, his detailed analysis of the engagements of the First World War are both pertinent and detailed. His ideas on mobile armoured forces and future of modern war would prove to be correct. It is a pity or a blessing from a modern perspective that one predicted warning he did make fell on deaf ears. Russia possesses the strongest army in the world, both in numerical terms and in terms of modernity of its weapons and equipment. The Russians have the world's largest air force as well. Russia has ample raw materials, and a mighty armaments industry has been set up in the depths of that vast empire. The time is past when Russians had no feeling for technology. We will have to reckon on the Russians being able to master and build their own machines, and with that fact, such a transformation in the Russians' fundamental mentality presents us with the Eastern question in a form more serious than ever before. Join us in a couple of weeks for the next podcast in Season 2, The Gurkhas. You've been listening to the History Network, written by Angus Wallace, read by Nick Barker.